Hi all, today we'll discuss about core Java with a Spring Boot real-time interview question. So these all are the interview questions which have interviewer more commonly will ask. So the first question is core Java with a Spring Boot real-time interview question. So what all are the key features of a Spring Boot first? So for the Spring Boot key features is auto configurations, embedded server, starter dependency, Spring Boot actuators and CLI. The next question is how do you create a RESTful API in a Spring Boot? So using RESTful API, we have REST controller, request mapping, get mapping, post mapping, and all. The next question is what is a Spring Boot starter? Give example. So a Spring Boot starter dependency to simplify building config, a Spring Boot starter web, a Spring Boot starter data GPA. Now the next question is what is the role of Spring Boot actuator? So Spring Boot actuator is used to provide a production ready features like monitoring, metrics, health checks and all. The next question is what is a Spring Boot application annotation? So it is a combination of configuration, enable auto configuration and component scan. Now the next question is how do you secure REST API in Spring Boot? So we have using a Spring Boot security with the JWT and auth 2 we will use the REST secure. Now the next question is how do you implement exception handling in Spring Boot? To implement exception handling, we have controller advice and exception handler. Through that, we have to do this. Now the next question is how what is the difference between component scan service, component service and repository? So the all are stereotype of notations. So service is used for the business logic, repository is used for the persistence, exception translations. And And the next question is how does Spring Boot manage dependency injection? So via annotations like auto-wire using constructor setters, injections and all. The next question is what is the use of profile in a Spring Boot? So to separate environment like dev, test, prod using a Spring application profile YAML. Now the next question is related for a Spring Boot with database. JPA, JDBC, MongoDB related constant. So the what is difference between Spring Data JPA and Hibernate? So Spring Data JPA is a wrapper over JPA Hibernate that simplify repository creations. Now the next question is what do you define relationship in JPA? So using one-to-one annotations, one-to-many annotations, many-to-one annotations, and many-to-many annotations. Now the next question is what all are the common performance tuning technique in JPA? So we have lazy loading, entity graph, DTO projections, and paginations. So these all are the common performance tuning technique in JPA. Now the next question is what is optimistic and pessimistic locking in JPA? So concurrency control, optimistic uses versioning, and then pessimistic locking DBA rows. Now the next question is how do you handle transaction in a Spring Boot? So using transactional annotations, we will handle the transaction in a Spring Boot. So the next question is how what is a n plus one query problem? How to solve it? So multiple query due to lazy loading, we have to solve using JSON fetch. So n plus one query problems will be solved using JSON fetch. Now the next question is how do you use MongoDB with a Spring Boot? So add a Spring Boot starter MongoDB and define the repository interface extending the Mongo repository. Now the next question is what is the difference between JPA repository and CRUD repository? So JPA repository extend paginations and sorting repository and adds JPA specific methods. Now the next question is how do you optimize query in a Spring Boot data JPA? So use the query projections and native query if needed. The next question is how do you log a SQL query in a Spring Boot? Set spring.jpa.source SQL true and enable logging for Hibernate. Now the next question is related for a Spring Boot DevOps, GitHub, Jenkins, CI/CD. So the first question is how do you integrate GitHubs with Jenkins? So using webhook and GitHub plugins in Jenkins to trigger the build on commit. The next question is what is Jenkins pipeline? So we have a Groovy based script for CI/CD automations in Jenkins file. Now the next question is what is multi-branch pipeline in Jenkins? So for that multi-branch pipeline in Jenkins is auto create pipeline for each branch using Jenkins file in the repo. Now the next question is how do you deploy the Spring Boot applications using Jenkins? So build with Maven, then copy the jar to server or Docker image to deploy these applications. Next question is how do you perform automated testing in Jenkins? So using Maven test phase and JUnit test ng plugins we will use to automate the testing in Jenkins. The next question is how do you use the Git branch in real project? So we have a features branch, develop branch, release branch, masters and main branch will be there, which is used to Git branch in real time project. Now the next question is what is Git rebase and merge? So Git rebase rewrite history linear and merge preserves branch history. The next question is what is Jenkins agents? A node that execute jobs can be on different machine is called Jenkins agent. Now the next question is how do you manage Jenkins cadences securely? So use Jenkins cadences plugins and inject them into the pipeline. Now the next question is how do you roll back a Jenkins if deployment failed? So use blue-green deployment or previous stable build tags. The next question is a Spring Boot related cloud AWS Azure GCP. What do you deploy a Spring Boot applications on AWS EC2? So create a EC2 instance, install Java scp.jar running using java-jar. Now the next question is how do you store secret in AWS? So use AWS secret managers or SSM parameters store. The next question is how what is S3 and how do you use for the Spring Boot? So we have object storage. So use AWS SDK to upload and download the files from S3. Now the next question is how do you use AWS RDS with a Spring Boot? So use RDS DB URL in application.property. Now the next question is what is the difference between ECS and EKS? So ECS is used for the Docker container orchestration and EKS used for the Kubernetes on AWS. Now then the next question is how do you implement logging in cloud environment? So use centralized logging with CloudWatch, ELK and Datadog. The next question is what is the benefits of using a Spring Cloud with a Spring Boot? So enable microservice patterns, config server services, discovery and circuit breakers, which is used for the benefits of a Spring Cloud with a Spring Boot. The next question is what is the role of API gateway in cloud deployment? So acts as a reverse proxy, rate limiting, authentications and routing. The next question is how do you use environment variable in a Spring Cloud deployment? So pass using system property or environment config. How do you monitor a Spring Cloud application in cloud? So use actuators plus Prometheus Grafana or AWS CloudWatch. The next question is advanced and real time project based. Explain your CI/CD pipeline setups for the microservices project. So we have used GitHub, push trigger Jenkins, build jar, run unit test, dockerized, push to EC2 and deploy on ECS and EKS. So explain your CI/CD pipeline setup for a microservice project. So for that we have GitHub, push trigger Jenkins, which have built the jar, then run the unit test, then dockerize the file, then push to ECR and deploy to the ECS and EKS. Now the next question is how do you handle service to service communication in microservices? So use REST template, web client and gRPC Eureka Red for the discovery. Now the next question is how do you ensure zero downtime deployment? So we have a blue green deployment or rolling updates with Kubernetes. The next question is how do you scale a Spring Boot application? So run multiple instance load balancing using AWS ALB or Kubernetes. The next question is how do you perform database migration? So use Flyway or Liquibase for the database migration. The next question is how do you implement centralized config management? So use a Spring Boot Cloud Config Server or AWS Parameters Store. The next question is how do you secure API in production? So we have HTTPS, JWT token, auth throttling API gateway, which is secure the API in production. Now the next question is, how do you manage log in distributed microservices? So we have to use centralized logging with ELK, Fluent, S3, Antenna. Now the next question is, how do you handle secret and central credentials securely? So externalized via secret manager, don't hardcode the config file. So via secret managers we have externalized. The next question is, how describe a real-time production issue you resolve. So memory leakage due to improper resource closures in DB connections fixed by the refactoring or monitoring the with actuators. So these all are the top 50 real-time interview questions with Java, with Spring Boot, microservices, GitHub, Jenkins, monitorings, cloud, and DB. Yeah, thank you.